ask ourselves the big question about the Europe and European Union today, which is whether it really is in crisis and whether this crisis is something that the member states and the citizens of Europe can or cannot overcome. So I think there is a very pessimistic conventional wisdom about this fact. So the conventional wisdom about disintegration in Europe goes something like this. First, Europe faces major challenges, and we'll talk about what those are in a minute, but major challenges, economic, social, political, and the only solution to these is more centralized EU institutions. But EU institutions are not centralizing. They're at best stagnating, at worst disintegrating, and as a result of that, and the main reason for that is deeper ideological conflict, which may come from social roots or just be a cultural phenomenon. Therefore, Europe cannot and is not addressing these crises successfully. So when you read the newspaper, when you read scholarly works, when you read things from think tanks, often this is the form that the argument takes. And I want to offer an alternative view that is more optimistic, but selectively optimistic. For those of you who work in European Union studies in political science, it's based on a theory, a broadly functional theory of the EU, arguing that the EU carries out relatively salient functional tasks for member states, and that these bargains that member states reach are stable. But I'm not going to get into the theory today in detail. Instead, I'm just going to look at the big picture facts that suggest that we should, if we believe this functional view, be more optimistic. So this view says governments and publics view most, and I mean really most, the overwhelming majority of the things that the European Union and Europe collectively does as successful and desirable, functionally desirable, indeed indispensable. And this is the input to the political discussion and political debate and politics of European integration. Secondly, even if centralized European institutions don't exist in some areas, as the Federalists always remind us, states are capable of cooperating, much as they cooperate elsewhere in the world, through convergence of policies, through coordination, through forming coalitions of the willing big enough to achieve tasks. So we should think of the European Union not as a hierarchy with centralized institutions which isn't working unless you centralize decisions, but more as a network and a bargaining space. And third, empirically, judged by realistic expectations, and I underscore realistic because I think it's very easy to criticize any institution for not achieving some ideal. But judged by realistic expectations, the substantive consequences of crisis management in Europe over the last 10 years have been surprisingly positive and successful. Indeed, in some cases, for example, I will talk about migration, amazingly successful, which may surprise some of you, but I want to be provocative in this talk. So I'm going to take 4 issues, the big issues facing Europe, and I'll let you all break them down in the next 2 days of this conference. But these 4 issues: Europe's global position and security policy. What about dealing with Russia? What about dealing with other threats throughout the world? Secondly, immigration or migration. Thirdly, the rise of populism. And fourthly, the euro and economic growth. And in each case, I will take an example. So I will use as the example of Europe's ability to deal with foreign policy crisis, Ukraine, with migration, the Mediterranean issues recently, the rise of populism, Brexit and other such exits, and the euro, Italy. And I am very optimistic, very positive. Indeed, I think the data forces you to be positive about the first three. The last one, I'm not so clear about. So we'll see how that goes. These really are the salient issues in Europe. So if you poll Europeans and you ask them, what issues should we be discussing in European elections and so on, they break down roughly into these groups. So you have the foreign security issues affecting the outside world. How can Europe do that effectively? Then you have the issues about migration, and the public associates terrorism with migration, rightly or wrongly. Thirdly, the issue of populism. Of course, these are taken from Eurobarometer, and the European Commission doesn't like to ask people what they think about populism. So it only appears here. And then you have the question of growth, inequality, macroeconomic steering. Now notice that though these four issues are important, I could have chosen a lot of other ones where probably none of you would debate that the European Union is doing well. We could have chosen climate change. So if anybody, again, realistic standards, if any part of the world is taking a leadership role on climate change, it's Europe, in part through the European Union. Regulatory policy, Europe is a regulatory superpower, as I'll discuss later, and is a leader in regulating various things, including the protection of personal data. And we could talk about things that don't even appear on this list, like the maintenance of the single market and the single regulatory space largely unchanged in the face of the largest recession and bump in post-war history. So there are lots of other optimistic stories we could tell, but I'm going to focus on these four. Just to underscore the importance of the populist issue, how the EU should be working. If you poll people about that, you see very substantial numbers of people in Europe who think that the rise of political parties opposing the existing elite is an important issue. So I think I've chosen the four most important issues. So let's take a look at these, starting with Europe's global position and power projection. So again, there is a conventional wisdom, and then there is an alternative view. The conventional, relatively pessimistic view is that Europe is geopolitically pretty weak compared to the US, China, and Russia. This is a kind of 19th century view. You have these big, unified, militarily robust states in the world, and they dominate geopolitics. Secondly, that centralized military spending is the best way to strengthen Europe in the world. It's actually surprising to an American how much Europeans, despite their criticisms of the United States, correct in my view, for over-militarizing many problems, themselves view increases in military spending as necessary to project global power. Certainly in places like Germany or France or Britain, that's the discourse. And the example people cite is Ukraine. The Russians pick on the Europeans. They can do what they want in Ukraine. Europe can't stand up to them, etc. So that's kind of the traditional conventional narrative you hear. The alternative view is that Europe is actually a superpower that projects not just military power, but economic power and soft power globally. Secondly, that this kind of power projection doesn't necessarily require that you be a centralized hierarchical state like Russia, China, or the US. And sometimes that's necessary, say in trade policy, but in many other areas, Europe is able to have an enormous impact on its outside world without necessarily having a central hierarchy in Brussels. And recent results have been positive, and the case I'm going to cite is exactly the same one, which is Ukraine. So first, let's look at what assets Europe has. Europe is tremendously powerful in the world. It is, first of all, powerful as a military power. Now, I don't think of Europe primarily as trying to influence the world through military power. I think it prefers, rightly, to use economic and institutional and soft power to do that. But even in the military area, Europe is one of the three great superpowers in the world. It has an enormous stock of military capacity, larger in deliverable terms than China, and it will for some time to come. It is really the only other entity on the face of the earth besides the United States that readily projects military force all over the place. The Russians do over their border, and they had one little adventure in Syria, but really it's the United States and Europe that do most of the activity, particularly if you compare it with a country like China. So if you look at the number of combat forces that actually get deployed abroad, the United States is of course preeminent, but Europe is a very substantial power. There are tens of thousands of European troops, combat troops, dealing with various problems throughout the world. If Europe decides it wants to intervene in Libya, it drags the Americans in, and the West intervenes in Libya. Even China can't do that kind of thing. And it has lots of security alliances throughout the world that help it do that. It's also very involved in anti-terrorist or activities against global networks of various kinds. And these efforts have been successful. If you look in recent years at the level of terrorism in Western Europe, it has gone down and down. It was largely internal and much more of a problem back when I was a student traveling around through places like the Bologna train station. Now you have, a tiny blip here, but basically the long-term trend is pretty good. Your chances as a European of being killed by foreign terrorists are less than your chances of being struck by lightning. So it's pretty effective. But as I said before, what Europe really does in the world is project power as a civilian superpower. It has other means, often means not available to the United States, to influence the world, particularly things like foreign aid. Most of the world's foreign assistance comes from Europe. And even if you added in, so these statistics are 3 years old, even if you added in Belt and Road, you'd only get China up to about here. Currently, it still wouldn't be more foreign aid than Europe. Europe has the European Union itself and all its neighborhood policies which structure economic relations with countries from Morocco all the way over to Ukraine. And then it has a whole nother series of things. It's a global trading power. It is the most powerful setter of regulatory norms anywhere in the world. So I would recommend Anu Bradford's work at Columbia University, which shows that Europe's position as a stringent regulator and a large market means that it sets the global regulations for many economic activities more than any other jurisdiction. It's the largest supporter of international organizations, as in the case of climate change. It sets constitutional norms for the world. So there are interesting studies of what people put in their constitutions when they write a constitution. Where do they get the things that go in the Constitution? They don't get it from the United States that has crazy ideas like a federal system with a president and unlimited money in elections and guns being a human right. They don't get them from China, which is not democratic at all. They get them from Europe and European countries, as well as Canada. And even sports and other soft power things. If you poll people throughout the world and ask them, what are the best run countries in the world? Boom, most of them are European. European countries is what most people want to be like. And I'm just doing this for fun, but Europe is the sports superpower of the world. If you look at who wins all the Olympic medals, it's the Europeans. And this is the Summer Olympics in the Winter Olympics, the Europeans win more medals than the entire rest of the world put together, thanks to those little Norwegians. So let's see an example. How do all these things, the soft power, the economic power, and the military security, come together to really change the world around Europe? An example would be Ukraine. So the Ukraine crisis starts in 2014, 2015, starts with Ukrainians wanting to be closer to Europe. This is Maidan Square. You see the soft power of Europe there. And subsequently, the Russians invaded Ukraine to try to block this. That war, despite what you might read in the newspapers, is essentially over. So the number of people killed in Ukraine now per month or even by quarter, according to the United Nations, is single digits. So basically, they fought a war for a short period of time and it's over. And what's the result of that war? The result of that war is that Ukraine, except for these little bits here, Ukraine is now firmly a Western country. What does this mean? It means that the West, particularly Europe, said to Russia, this country, Ukraine, which is the most important, most proximate country to Russia, industrially, militarily, and culturally, is ours now. You can have these little bits if you want to fight for them. The rest of the country is for now and forevermore part of the West. That is, now you can say that was a mistake or we shouldn't have done it, but that's an enormous exercise of power. And it's stuck. It is now successful. The question is, how did they do it? What did Europe do to support the Ukrainians? And here is where you see the power of civilian resources. Because every Western country, the Europeans, the Americans, everybody said, we are not going to send military forces to fight Russia in Ukraine. So how do you fight Russia in Ukraine? Answer, with European civilian power. Okay, first thing, economic aid to Ukraine. That economic aid is 10 to 15 billion euros a year. Okay? Without that aid, Ukraine goes bankrupt, and you don't need to discuss how to defend it or how to reform it. And secondly, you give Ukraine a way to integrate into the Western world via trade and migration. Poll Ukrainians, and they will tell you the most important foreign policy issue facing Ukraine is open immigration to work in the West. Over 1 million Ukrainians, mostly in Poland. Thirdly, you endure sanctions and counter-sanctions against Russia. Hard to know how much this costs Europe, but some estimates are up to 0.5% of GDP per year. That is an enormous commitment to a foreign policy goal, and that's adding the sanctions and the counter-sanctions together. And finally, diplomatic activity with Russia and Ukraine. Now, what's interesting about these things is that they're not military, and they're all European. So I was involved in a project where we actually measured each of these, and this is what you get. 91% of the funds to Ukraine from the West come from Europe. 93% of the trade, and more than that of the migration, is Europe. 89% of the costs of sanctions are borne by the Europeans, because the Americans don't trade with either Ukraine or Russia much. And over 90% of the high-level diplomatic interactions with Ukraine. This is a European policy carried out by Europeans and costly. And Europe is able to do it because it's an economic superpower. Because if you look at Russian trade, it's almost all with the EU. The United States is insignificant. China, despite recent headlines, is pretty insignificant. So Europe is leveraging its diplomatic, soft power, and economic resources to change things in the world and to defend itself against Russia. This seems like an extraordinary success by any cost-effective success by any normal standards. Second issue, migration. Again, the conventional view, which I'm sure most people in the room hold, is migration is a form of interdependence. It's increasing uncontrollably. There's not really very much we can do about it. Europeans lack centralized institutions and political will to stem this threat, so they fight amongst themselves all the time about it. And the example which is always cited is the crisis of 2015, which shows that we're all slaves to growing interdependence. The alternative view, which I will defend, is that migration can be deterred very cost effectively if countries have the will to act, which means doing things that are ethically uncomfortable to most of us, including me, but are necessary political goals, particularly domestically. Europeans all agree that they need to act, and despite what, for example, left-wing parties say in some countries, their policies are all restrictive. Francois Hollande, Barack Obama, Mrs. Merkel, these are moderate or left-wing politicians, but they all agree on closing migration. And even modestly centralized policies can be very effective. And the example, again, is exactly the example that the critics of Europe cite. So first of all, let's see that migration crisis is basically over. So this is the level of uncontrolled migration over the Mediterranean. And it's divided up into the people that come to Greece, the people that come to Italy, the people that come to Spain. So one by one, first they closed Greece. Then they closed Italy, and now some people are going to Spain. But when you get here, you're talking about numbers of 30,000 or less per year. Now they're in the process of closing Spain. So you can reduce migration to a level below what it was back 10 years ago. This is not a demand side phenomenon. It's not that there aren't migrants there. It's that they can't or won't get here. So what did Europe do to achieve this? And here we have a good example of decentralized, coordinated policies that are very effective. And you also see here the moral ambiguity of this. So first they established repatriation agreements with various countries. Turkey, everybody talks about, also Libya, here in Italy, and even Egypt. They build walls. Trump is not the only person who builds walls. Greece builds walls, Bulgaria builds walls, Spain builds electronic walls, and metal walls in Morocco. Hungary builds walls on the external borders of the EU. Countries impose border controls to make it difficult to move in case people get through. Countries criminalize trafficking. If you own a ferry in Greece now and you take a migrant, you are subject to criminal prosecution. People remove the EU boats from the ocean who were patrolling but were under a legal obligation to pick up migrants, making it harder to cross. They put police, Sicilian policemen on NGO boats in the Mediterranean. They tighten asylum and make life in destination countries more difficult. All you have to do is see those big burly French policemen on the other side of the border up by Genoa, and you know that this is true. And they give quite a bit of military and non-military assistance to origin and transit countries. Now, the criticism of this policy is that it's ruthless to migrants, that migrants die in the Mediterranean as a result. And the kind of statistics you see are things like this, which look at the risk of crossing as Europe closes its border. It's true that the risk to a migrant goes up. That's the purpose of the policy, is to deter migration by increasing the risk. But the result is fewer people try and fewer people die. So what you see is you've driven down the death rate on the way to Europe to a lower absolute number than it was in 2014. With the result over time that you slowly diffuse migration as an internal political issue. Public opinion is a lagging indicator, but you do see that over time, concern that we should discuss migration as one of the top issues peaks and then goes down. So migration is a good example of a decentralized European policy that works to achieve things that all European states want, even if they don't admit it in public, extremely well. Third issue, right-wing populism, a delicate issue in Italy. So the conventional view is we now live in a post-functionalist view. Again, this is a reference to debates in European Union studies about whether the preferences of countries as regards policies, the substantive preferences, are driven by functional issue-specific concerns or broad ideological conflicts. And many people believe it's broad ideological conflicts between nationalists, pro-Europeans, and so on that are really driving state policy today. So this creates a zero-sum conflict between countries in Europe, and therefore they can't cooperate. So this is a very common narrative because Orban and the Brexit Party and Salvini can't agree with other people. They don't get anything done. And the result is we see Europe falling apart or just unable to act. And all the populists are cited as examples of this. The alternative view is that actually the functional theory still holds, that populists are more bark than bite, particularly on foreign policy. They promise a lot, they talk a lot, but implementation is very difficult in politics. You can win an election by promising broad things, but when you need to implement policies, then experts, very interested parties like business and so on, come into the game. They also come into the game if you want to form a government coalition. And so it's difficult actually to implement these things. So the argument is, first, electorally, populists are actually weaker than you think. Again, we'll talk about Italy in a second. And when they implement policies, functional concerns, pursuing policies that are minimally acceptable to 50% of a country, imposes an enormous constraint on what a populist actually does. Example, again, the same example that the critics cite is Brexit. So let's go through this chain. Populist foreign policies fail because after an election or a referendum, they must be implemented. So how does that work? First, you need to get into government. If you're a populist, this is your plan. You need to get into government. Then you need to form a set of alliances that allow you to be large enough to enact meaningful reform, because most populist, truly populist parties don't have more than 20 or 30% of the vote. So they need another 25 or 30% somewhere. So they need a coalition. And then, even if their country is really committed to a policy, they need to bargain with other countries to make it happen in foreign policy. And populists fail on every level of this chain. So let's start with getting into government. It's actually pretty hard for right-wing populists to get into government because they are characteristically about 10 or 20, sometimes 25% of the electorate. Hungary is an exception. Even Salvini's current poll numbers are an exception. In most countries, these are small fringe parties. So quite a number of them can't really get elected. In France, Marine Le Pen has almost no power. I'll show you that in a minute. The UKIP and the British National Party didn't. We'll see how the Brexit Party does in the upcoming elections, but so far. And others, even if they get some seats in parliament or something, are always excluded from ruling coalitions, like the Alliance for Deutschland or the right-wingers in Holland. So let's take Marine Le Pen, because Marine Le Pen ran for president in France. I counted before the first round of the French election for 1 month the English language newspaper stories about Marine Le Pen and the threat she posed. More than 10,000 of them. More than 10,000 stories about someone whose probability of becoming French president was 0. Marine Le Pen lost by double digits in the polls against any conceivable opponent, including the far, far left-wing opposition. And she has almost no power in France. This is what Marine Le Pen has. She was defeated 2-1 in an election, which in any other country, and she has 7 of over 500 deputies in the parliament, 1 of 400 senators, no regional council control, a few members at a lower level, no presidencies of a department. The only thing she can do is get 15 people elected to the relatively fake elections to the European Parliament. This is not a recipe for grabbing political power in a way that you're going to be effective. The recent European parliamentary elections are similar. They're reported many ways in the newspapers, but if you break the numbers down like this, between parties that are clearly pro-European, that's the dark blue, parties that are somewhere in the middle, and parties that are truly Eurosceptical, the only real shift is here between these. The number of pro-European parties went from 70 to 68% of the parliament, right? Hardly a significant change. The shift is here, and most of that's actually fake, because the British Conservatives were counted here as a middle-of-the-road party, but some of them were Eurosceptic, so they should have been orange here. And then when the Brexit Party came in, they got counted as orange. So really, it's a counting error that leads to this change. Again, there's no majority there. There's no power over the European Parliament there. The reason people oppose the populists is, among other things, that besides the issue of migration, where everybody agrees there should be closure, they don't agree with the policy positions of migrants, of populists, particularly on Europe. So if you look, for example, on a simple indicator, would you be in favor of voting to leave the EU? There's really only one country that has a truly significant number of people. That's Britain, which did, and always has been an exception. For everybody else, it's a relatively small number. So what's the response of populists to this? They moderate. Look at Marine Le Pen again. So 3 or 4 years ago, 5 years ago, Marine Le Pen was in favor of Frexit. She was in favor of leaving the euro. 2 years ago, when she ran for president, she had no coherent position because she realized she had to appeal to a broader electorate, so she just said a lot of things, but there were no concrete policy. And then for the European elections, she said, oh, well, you know, I've rethought. I'm in favor of the EU. I'm in favor of the euro. Because that is the only way to get elected. So don't think that the populists are this powerful force. And that is why populist policies aren't spreading. We don't hear anything anymore about Frexit and Dexit and Grexit, Italexit. We'll talk about the euro in a minute, but I'm talking about the European Union as a whole. Nobody talks about that. Even Orban and the Poles never talk about pulling out of the European Union because they know it would be suicidal, particularly in a country like Poland, where over 90% of the people poll as being pro, no pun intended, poll as being pro-European. And even where populists have some influence, they don't agree with each other. So it's very hard for them to wield power. Suppose they do get elected, and suppose they do get into a coalition. What happens to them? Most of them get destroyed. So that's what happened in Austria twice. So there were two governments, one early in the millennium, and then one recently, where the far right was part of the government, in coalition with the moderate right, and in both cases got destroyed. I had this strange experience of being in Montana at a conference with Sebastian Kurz, the Chancellor of Austria, former Chancellor of Austria, where nobody else knew who he was. It was all Google people, and who's this Sebastian Kurz? So I sit with him for 2 hours over lunch, and so I asked him, what's it like to be in a coalition with a right wing? He said, no problem. I said, really? He said, yeah. He said, we agree on migration, so we pursue a migration policy. They really care about the police force, so I let them run the police force. And other than that, I say, we'll give you a bunch of nice civil service jobs and let me take care of the policy. Thank you very much. What's the result of that? You get a very pro-European policy from Austria, a successful presidency of the EU. Austria is publicly in favor of enlargement. It's in favor of centralizing economic functions. You don't get a transformation when these people come into office. So, except in Italy, which we'll discuss in a minute, migration is the populist's only salient and visible EU policy, and everybody basically agrees with them now about it, even if they don't admit it. So, they have very little influence over what happens. Look at Brexit. Now I'll be really controversial. Brexit negotiations have been largely symbolic. From the very start, the British said, what we'd really like is to have all the same rules that we have now, except for maybe free movement and a few other things. But we want to call it something else. We want to pull out of the EU, but please don't take away our trading opportunities. Please don't regulate our banks. Please don't do all this stuff, right? That's the British position. So they want, and so we see that when you see the successive British negotiating positions. They started, for example, by saying every single European citizen in Britain ought to have a special status and ought to be able to remain. That was their starting position in the negotiation. And it only got worse after that. They kept conceding things, and nonetheless, the Brexiteers do not have a domestic majority for any change from the status quo. So this is not a powerful movement. This is something that can only generate Brexit almost by accident over the objections of Parliament. And even where British say, yes, we really want to do something different, maybe we want to change the rules about free movement of people, they have to bargain with the Europeans. And they're in a very bad position to bargain with the Europeans because trade and interaction with Europe is 4 times larger as a percentage of GDP for them than it is for the Europeans. So elementary bargaining theory tells you this is not a good position to be in. And if that weren't bad enough, what's their alternative? They can go negotiate with China, with Trump, with India. The only thing worse than negotiating with Europe is negotiating with Trump or India. So the British do not really have a credible position. It's very hard for them to generate enough change that they have a domestic majority in favor of it, and the result is they don't, and they're stuck. And so I think it's fair to conclude that whatever the future legal status of the UK, almost all the substantive policies are going to stay the same. The only way that doesn't happen is if the system gets completely out of control of everybody. But actually, I don't see how that can happen without a parliamentary vote, and I don't see how you get a parliamentary vote for anything more than a very modest shift from the status quo. This is referred to as the Hotel California effect. You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. But the interesting thing is, right, the interesting thing about this is that it's not because the Europeans are forcing the British to do something. It's because the British are recognizing what their own interests are. And that happens to every populist. Brexit, therefore, becomes BRINO, my favorite acronym that Wolfgang Münchau coined. Brexit in name only. In fact, that's the perfect outcome for a populist. It sounds like Brexit, but it isn't. That way, your coalition, which is the nationalists and the business people, stays together. And I think everybody has this problem. My guess is Salvini will have this problem as well. And so Brexit negotiations have been largely symbolic, and all we really need to ask is, will any Brexit happen, or will they just stall until the issue dies? Could it happen by accident? What few policies might London have the negotiating power to change? And how much worse off is the UK going to be, because this is all pretty crazy? And then finally, on populism, suppose you actually control the entire government. Suppose you don't need a coalition. Suppose you run the country. That would be Mr. Orban, which my Hungarian relatives gladly voted for. They love Orban. Not me, but my relatives are crazy. So all Hungarian families are crazy. You need to know that. So how much difference does it make for European cooperation and for foreign policy that Orban runs Hungary? And the answer is almost none. So it's very hard to find issues on which Hungary has taken a position that was uncooperative and really almost none where it had any impact at all. Rhetorically, Orban's a good talker. And he loves to go after policies like migrant quotas that are basically fake policies, that are neither technocratically nor politically possible. Then he runs a referendum against them and wins 95%. But real policies, he quietly supports them. And so, you know, the concerns about Hungary people have are mostly, are there Russian spies? Are they a little too upset about what goes on in Ukraine? You know, but these are minor issues. On the big issues, Hungary plays along. Why? Because it's a small country. It's dependent on investment and trade with Europe, and it has no incentive to change anything. So the only concern we really have is whether Hungary is democratically governed, and it's an interesting issue, but doesn't raise the viability of the EU. That leaves only one country where populism might actually still get into power, and which they could have a major impact on Europe, and where they have any issue to talk about except migration, and that country is, of course, Italy. So for a long time, I've said Italy is the weakest link. Italy is the only place that can really be a problem. And that goes back, I think, to the euro. If it were just migration, then the fact that migration is being closed down would mean sooner or later Salvini can't keep talking about migrants when there are no more migrants coming to Italy. But the euro is a constant problem. And here I'm a little bit more pessimistic. I'm also going to be short, because I know that there are lots of economists, there are lots of points of view in the room, and I think also it's hard to know what the right policy is with regard to the euro. But I think, again, this is not a case where Europe is in trouble because it's too weak or too divided. So the conventional view is that the euro is a necessary policy, it's a good policy, it's a valuable policy, but somehow it's not working very well. This is certainly what you hear in Brussels and from pro-Europeans. So second point, it can only be rescued if we have stronger, centralized European fiscal, potentially monetary, regulatory tools. And third, EU member states lack the political will, maybe because they're all ideologically divided and therefore it won't work well. An alternative view is that the euro is not a good policy for a lot of people. It's intrinsically a suboptimal policy. Countries went into it, in my view, as a historian of European integration because they wanted, some countries privileged low interest rates, other countries privileged low real effective exchange rates. They did a deal, but that deal was not premised for its long-term stability on convergence, and that convergence didn't happen, and now you've got countries that are really in an unsustainable position. So modern institutional adaptation and deepening has helped the euro weather crises, but it cannot solve the problems. It's an order of magnitude too small. You can just do a simple thought experiment. The United States has a monetary union. Most people think it works pretty badly. So parts of the country have low economic growth, and the response of the federal government is not, let's give you money, let's give you support. The response is, move to Arizona, right? That's the American policy toward macroeconomic disparities. And how much money does the United States spend on this? Somewhere on the order of 10 to 15% of GDP of a state like Connecticut gets moved countercyclically to a state like Michigan. So the question you have to ask yourself is simple. Are the Germans going to give 10 or 15% of their GDP to other countries? The answer to that question is no. So we can say there is no viable political solution, not even close. And discussions of 1% shifts of GDP just seem to me totally beside the point. But the euro hasn't collapsed because the short-term consequences of doing so are uncertain and potentially costly. And politicians hate doing things with short-term costs but potential long-term benefits. So the only way that we change the status quo would be to engineer a market reaction that leads the system to collapse. And I think, you know, if you give Salvini credit for thinking these things through, that's more or less their plan. Because it's the only logical plan remaining if you think that this is not a good situation. The odd thing is that it's very, very difficult to do. You know, whether he would have the political support, the technical capacity, whether this is feasible is unclear. So strangely, the euro is not a case where the problem is Europe is too weak. It's a case where Europe is too strong. The Europeans pursued a policy that's not just strong, but surprisingly stable, even though it's dysfunctional. So the odd thing is that in this particular case, really because of the time inconsistency problem, European policies are powerful, stable, effective, even when the ultimate outcomes are not good. So one way to think about it is that this is a potential source of disaster for Europe. But another way to think about it is it actually shows how powerful and successful Europe is, even when it's trying to achieve things that are bad. Final question, final slide, then I'm done. So if I'm right, and Europe is actually surprisingly successful at achieving realistic goals in foreign policy with regard to migration, with regard to combating populism, even in the case of the euro, why does everybody believe the opposite? Well, I'm sure 90% of you came into the room thinking the opposite. And I think that is because our public debate in every country is dominated by people who have an interest in making it seem as if things are worse than they are. Okay? So who are these people? Politicians. So Eurosceptical politicians want to say bad things about Europe, but interestingly, Federalist politicians do too. The Federalist discourse is, things are terrible here in Europe. They're awful. They're about to collapse. We need more centralized Europe in order to achieve it. In a strange way, the Euro-Federalists are the greatest Eurosceptics about the status quo. They're always telling you things are bad, we need to do more. The status quo doesn't appeal to them. Secondly, the media. You cannot, the truth about the European Union and international politics generally is it's incredibly boring. Really boring. So the way you make a story is to say, Marine Le Pen is going to be elected, and then she's going to pull out of Europe, and the European Union will collapse. And then in paragraph 16, you say, well, actually, she doesn't have any chance of winning the second round, and actually, France doesn't want to pull out, and actually, she no longer has this policy, et cetera. But that's the way people talk about it. And finally, us. Everybody wants, we scholars, we policy analysts, we love crises. People pay attention to our issues. We can make proposals for fixing them. But I think that our job as policy analysts is to take a sober, long-term, trend-wise view of situations, because that's our comparative advantage, not chasing the headlines. And if we do that, you see that in all the major areas in which there's meant to be a crisis, Europe, we have far less reason to be pessimistic about Europe than you might think. I know you all disagree with this, so I'm looking forward to your comments. Thank you.
Thank you.